It's a new morning and I'm working on power distribution. This auxiliary battery and all these extra accessories are going to take a lot of power, and so what I've decided to do is I'm going to add a fuse block underneath the dash to bring direct power from the battery to the fuse block, inline fuses to all the accessories. That way it's all clean, tucked underneath the dash, all in one location. I've got my fuse block installed and I've run all the wires through a loom and of course run it across out through the opening of my dash here. So now that I've got all the wires out, I've got to label and figure out exactly which wire goes to which portion of the fuse panel. The fairly permanent solution that I've got is I've color-coded the wires with zip ties. So now I know which wire runs through the loom and which one it's going to actually end up going to. That way I can keep track of the wiring. Got my battery in, I've got the cover back on, and I've got my toggle switch installed. So last night, I started working on the wiring for the tower speakers. I spent a lot of hours trying to figure out exactly how to run the wires. I didn't want them exposed externally. So as much as it pains me to say, I decided I was going to drill holes in the roll cage in order to run the wires through. I mounted the tower speakers on here to get an idea of exactly where I wanted everything centered. And for my application, I decided from the corner to the center of the mount, 14 inches is what I wanted. So I could measure everything out where I wanted it to be. I drilled the hole and I started running the wire. And then, of course, what I quickly figured out is the roll cage, there's no pass-through inside here. It's all solid steel. So there was a complication in trying to get the wires passed through. There's a hole in the existing down tube where I've run the wire out, drilled another hole into the down tube itself to run the speaker wire through. And I've covered the speaker wire in a piece of heat shrink to try to protect it from any of those sharp edges. The wires exit through a hole in the bottom of the down tube. I'm going to slip a piece of PVC tubing over that to protect the wires from chafing, and then run the wires to the amplifier. I had a very difficult time figuring out where to mount my amplifier. I've seen people put them in the dash, I've seen people put them inside the glove box, and my understanding is on the factory stereos that have amplifiers, they're actually mounted right on top of the glove box. But once I pulled the glove box out, I found another spot that I thought would work a little better. With the glove box out of the way, there's a cubby hole in the back on the exterior of the center console that my amplifier will fit perfectly in. I've already cut a hole to run my wires through. Moving along to my tower speakers now. I'm going to get these up on the mount itself. Got my soldering iron. Got a dose of patience. I'm going to see if I can get these wires soldered together. We'll get them installed. Another point that I want to make, I'm staggering my cuts in the wires so that when I solder these things together, that extra bit of thickness I get of solder on here, I don't have those two joints matching up with one another where I'm going to have a very thick spot of the wire, which would make it difficult to run it back into the roll cage. I've purchased an inexpensive set of pod lights that I'm going to use as backup lights. So I like this location. There's a spot where a rivet holds the interior of the bed on. I'm going to drill out the rivet and I'm going to use the existing hole in order to mount my pod light. I've got the light installed and the wire is run externally. Still have quite a bit of work I have to do in the dash, but this should be enough for a test. I'll fully admit that I don't know that much about wire size, wire gauges, and so I did research online to try to figure some things out. Most of the wire I've dealt with is just like 16 gauge primary wire, speaker wires, that sort of stuff. I did have a relatively short piece of 10 gauge, and I certainly knew that I wanted something larger than that for my battery cable. And what I ended up deciding on was 4 gauge. So between the 2 batteries, I've run a 4 gauge wire, and I've also ordered 8 gauge wire that I'm planning on running the amplifier as well as my fuse block on. 4 gauge wire for the batteries was probably overkill. 8 gauge would have been good enough, but go big or go home. For my fancy high-tech CVT fan, I decided to go with a marine bilge blower. This one is a 3-inch diameter. I believe it delivers 125 CFM if I remember correctly, but it's a very, very low amp draw, something like 2 amps, so something very small. Of course, none of the ductwork up underneath the dash for the CVT itself actually has a 3-inch opening. The closest I have is 1 joint, and it's 2 3/4 inches, but I've bought some adapters. I'm going to be able to make this fit in line. Of course, the intake tube itself didn't fit. Nothing on this is round. Everything is oblong or oval shaped or some strange diameter. So what I ended up doing was just using my blowtorch, letting it warm up the plastic, get it soft and somewhat moldable, and I've got it as close to a 3-inch round opening as possible, at least enough to get the boot on there with a hose clamp. So I'm going to get that installed. We'll see what that looks like. I've got all the ductwork hooked back up, and I've got my inline fan hooked up, and I've got my toggle switch temporarily wired up. Power's on. There we go. So it's got a little bit of noise to it. It's fairly loud, but it does seem to have some fairly good flow.